Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second in a series of 3 webinars hosted by the Tahoe-Central Sierra Initiative, or TCSI. My name is Amanda Malici. I'm the Outreach and Capacity Building Associate for the Tahoe-Central Sierra Initiative. TCSI partners designed this webinar series to share TCSI's science-based tools, products, and research that can be used to guide restoration and forest management practices in the Tahoe-Central Sierra region and across California. Funding for this project has been provided in part by the California Tahoe Conservancy. So thank you all for joining. The TCSI is a partnership dedicated to restoring resilience to 2.4 million acres of Sierra Nevada forests and watersheds through innovation and collaboration. The TCSI's research and tools underpin a shared restoration strategy across all land ownerships and can be applied throughout the state. So today, this webinar will cover tools that integrate climate modeling into forest management. As we all know, climate change is affecting our forests and they are continuing to change. So we really need to think about how we plan for the long-term health of our forests when they're in dynamic conditions. So today we're going to hear from ecologist Dr. Nick Povak and Dr. Kristen Wilson, who are creators of the Tahoe-Central Sierra Initiative Blueprint for Resilience, on new methods and case studies for including climate change scenarios into forest management planning. Like I mentioned, this is the second webinar of a 3-part series. So our first webinar happened last week, and we have a recording of that. It was about the framework for resilience and defining resilience in California's forests. And our upcoming webinar on November 15th will highlight new research from Dr. Claire Scholert with the University of Washington School of Public Health about the smoke impacts of wildfire and prescribed fire, and it'll offer recommendations for land managers seeking to reduce smoke impacts on public health and safety. You can learn more about all of these webinars and watch recordings of them, and also learn more about TCSI's work at www.tahoecentralsierra.org, and I'll post all of that into the chat in a second here. But for now, I'll go ahead and turn things over to my colleague, Kristen Wilson, who will share more information about this webinar and kick things off and introduce our featured speakers today. So Kristen, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. So I wanted to just quickly add that you introduced Nick and myself, but I want to also introduce Pat Manley, who's with us. Dr. Pat Manley was also one of the creators of this Blueprint for Resilience and is here with us today. Great. So I'm really excited to be here to talk with Nick and Pat about adding climate change into resilience planning. My name is Kristen again, and I'm the lead forest scientist for the Nature Conservancy. We're hoping that this is going to be more of a conversation, so I'm holding my glass here and cheers to both Nick and Pat as we discuss the science and take a few questions. We're going to go through 4 different main questions, and if you want to ask a question, you can do that at the end of each section. We'll take 1 or 2 questions. And I think I'll pass it to Nick to introduce yourself.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Kristen. Yep, Nick Povak, Pacific Southwest Research Station. I'm a research ecologist. I've been working with Pat for the past 3 years, starting off with the blueprint, where we sort of stretched our legs and sort of worked on this blueprint together and came up with this promote model that kind of integrates both current conditions and a future conditions assessment to sort of help develop climate-informed management solutions for large landscapes such as the TCSI. Thanks.
And Pat, can you please introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, hi everyone. Pat Manley, research ecologist with the Pacific Southwest Research Station as well. Work with Nick and on this and other projects. And Nick's going to be your primary narrator. And just really excited for this webinar, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about this work. So thanks.
Great. All right, let's jump right in. So the first thing I want to talk to you about, Nick, talk with you about, excuse me, early morning, I'm ready. The question I have for you is, why don't we just stick with the status quo of sort of chasing stands that are most departed and treating them? What is it about climate change? Why do we need to bring this into our forest management planning?
Yeah, great. Thanks. Thanks very much, Kristen, and thank you everyone for having me. This is such a pleasure. The TCSI work has been sort of a hallmark for me, where we, like I said, developed this model, but working with all you great folks in development has been, sort of a highlight for me. So thank you. So to answer your question, it's first I just want to talk about how we kind of envision these systems. And so we can sort of, take a look at this slide and sort of take our moment of Zen and just kind of look at these forests and sort of see how you react to them. One of the things is, the status quo is, thinking sort of singly about management objectives. So maybe you're thinking about risk reduction to resources, or maybe you're thinking about getting the cutout, a timber oriented objective. And all of those, both of those are fine ways of viewing the forest. The problem is that forests and landscapes are complex systems, example of complex systems. And there's a few things about that is important, particularly when we think about climate change. One is that they're highly interdependent systems, and so there's many interacting parts with them. So the old saying is that the whole is much greater than the sum of the parts. When that rings really true, I think, to forested landscapes. For instance, a lot of the properties that we're managing for are sort of emergent properties. So a stand of trees isn't just sort of the individual trees themselves. It's sort of the habitat it provides. It's the nutrient cycling. It's the carbon sequestration. It's the biodiversity. And those are the sort of things that are really important. The other thing about complex systems is that they're what's called nonlinear. And why that's important is things like tipping points sort of exist in these systems. So, you might have several stands of trees, and when they're highly interconnected, there's opportunities for interactions among them. For instance, fire going through, maybe it would otherwise be a low severity fire in a really broken up landscape. But when you have high, reach a tipping point and you reach this percolation threshold, you might see fires actually raging in the crowns rather than just sort of these mundane little fires. So those things are important. And what we're doing with climate change is we're kind of cranking up the dial on all of these processes. And so we may find ourselves, past some of these tipping points in these systems. And so, when you look at the forest on top, is this a resilient system or not? Well, I mean, I guess it depends. First is the scale that we're looking at. If you look at individual patches, you see possibly some logging there, a past disturbance. Maybe that stand would be less resilient in someone's mind. But when taken in sort of a broader landscape view, it's actually providing some heterogeneity on the landscape. And we see patches of dead trees in the bottom left and the top, and maybe that's indicative of something changing. But also it's providing, habitat, through snags and sequestering carbon in just sort of a different way. And so, how we view these landscapes, I think, is really important. And that's where, when Pat was last week presented on the framework for resilience and described the 10 pillars, I think that provides a very interesting lens and in terms of how we view landscapes and how we go about managing them. And so maybe you can switch to the next slide. And this would just sort of be an example, like a schematic of how those things operate. So you have, this is from a paper by Christina Mitchell, and it looks at just what I was talking about. You have these different stands and how they're interacting, and you see these non-linearities. So when vertical ladder fuel continuity increases, you see the likelihood of crown fire increasing. And when you reach these percolation thresholds, you see fires actually spanning landscapes rather than patches. So this is, kind of where we are. And so, there's other frameworks now that are out there, including these sort of resist, accept, direct, so this RAD framework that really helps us think about how to incorporate climate change into the way we think about and conceptualize landscapes and how we incorporate management into it. Historically, we've looked to the past to sort of inform the future. So what did forest stands, what was their density before pre-European settlement? How large did fires get? How big were high severity patches? Well, as systems change, as the climate changes and puts more pressure on these landscapes, we may find that that information is less important moving forward. Maybe we're ending up with these no analog climate conditions where, there's really nowhere on the landscape that is similar moving forward. So we're actually left with less information and way more uncertainty than we did before. And so these kind of frameworks help us conceptualize them and help us understand what the decision space is when we go to manage. So in certain areas of the landscape, perhaps there's really key, ecosystem services that these stands or patches are providing. So maybe we want to, put a lot of effort into managing them so they stay on the landscape. In other areas, maybe the climate pressures are going to be so great that we might think about transitioning them into new types, or accepting the fact that, forests may be converted to things like shrublands or oak woodlands. So I think that the sort of shift that we're seeing is moving away from sort of this natural range of variability towards including that as one of many sort of tools in our tool belt in terms of sort of the strategic and tactical decisions that we're making.
Great. Yeah. So what I got is it's really important that climate change be brought to forest management planning and actions, because we can't just use the approach that we have been using. We need to account for all this change that's happening in the non-linearities and the landscape scale that you talked about. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I'm not sure, Amanda, if anything came through on the chat.
One thing came through on the chat, and someone was looking for the recording from last week's webinar, so not quite related to this section, but I just wanted to let everyone know that last week's webinar will be uploaded to Tahoe-Central-Sierra.org within the coming weeks, so it'll be up there soon. But nothing else related to this section, Kristen.
Okay, great. We will go on to the next one then. And actually, this one, Nick, you're going to be asking me, I think.
Yes, thank you, Kristen. So the question is, how do you determine how many acres to treat?
All right, I'm going to talk about the Tahoe-Central Sierra Initiative specifically and how we tried to tackle this question. And we were really trying to test how much management you would have to do across the whole TCSI landscape, which is about 2.4 million acres. So how much thinning and prescribed fire would you need to implement, how many acres per year, in order to improve resilience? And so, we spent a lot of time creating the framework for resilience. In terms of the modeling that we did to answer this question, we used a model called Landis 2. And by we, I mean, there were a lot of leads in this, and in particular, Charles Maxwell was the main author, and Rob Scheller, who developed this model Landis that was used, as well as Pat and others involved in this study that we did. So again, we're trying to figure out how many acres per year to treat to improve resilience. And what we came up with was a bunch of scenarios of management into the future that we could implement, and compared them. So different scenarios, how would they impact resilience? And we looked in particular at the impact on mortality of trees was one of the things. And so within the Tahoe-Central Sierra Initiative, we came up with 6 different scenarios, and they're shown here in the maps on the right. And so the way that we set these up was to increase the amount of thinning and prescribed fire across scenarios 1 through 6. So what you're looking at here in the bottom is the reference, or the historic fire return interval. So we had to rely on something to say how often we think the landscape would have burned. And this is that historic fire return interval. So you can see in red, the landscape in this area was burning about every 15 years, but it ranged, from every 15 years up to, every 50 years. And so we set up these scenarios to try and increase treatment beyond the wildland urban interface, or beyond the infrastructure and the homes that exist in the landscape. So scenario 1 is treating areas close to the wildland urban interface, as well as private timberlands. So places where you're harvesting timber for production. And then throughout the different scenarios, we're treating more of the landscape, which you can see in these figures, up into trying to match that disturbance return interval. So just to say that we, did a lot of effort to make these scenarios realistic with the treatment prescriptions matching the type of work that's done today. And what we found, and is published in this study led by Charles Maxwell, was that we found that at about scenario 3, which was 60,000 acres per year, the mortality of trees decreased. And so one thing to keep in mind, and Nick, you mentioned the uncertainty. So here we're showing different climate projections in the graphs. So these are the names of different climate projections from CAN ESM in the top left down to the MIROC projection, RCP 8.5 in the bottom right. So, you know, projections, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in terms of the precipitation change and the temperature change, but this allows us to kind of bracket it. And in the process of the study, we realized that this MIROC climate model on the bottom right there was best able to capture recent droughts as well as big fire events that were happening. And when you look at the bar graph, we noticed a decrease in mortality with scenario 3, which is the green bars in that MIROC example. So this is one way that we tried to think about how to target the number of acres to treat in this landscape. And then we built on the science here to work with the whole TCSI team to come up with a regional plan. And that plan is posted on the website if you want to learn more. But this is how we backed into the acres to trees. We used modeling with climate change and different management scenarios to figure out how many acres to treat.
Thanks, Kristen. That was great. It's good to see these results again and published in the literature. Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Please, yes, please.
How have these results been, or how have folks responded to these results? Have you interacted with anybody who is actually using these results to sort of suggest these number of acres treated or the types of treatments? For instance, I think scenario 3, like you mentioned, relies more on prescribed fire or as the main tool. I think that's the case. So can you just sort of briefly describe the interactions you've had with folks on this study specifically?
Sure. So we were, in this case, working with 3 forest supervisors for the Tahoe National Forest, Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit, and the El Dorado. And Pat has actually done more work in terms of getting this into the hands of the forest supervisors to really use it to guide work on the forests. But I'd say there's a pretty concerted effort across this landscape to increase the pace and scale of treatment. And now we do have a goal set, and we can compare the work that's happening in different large projects like the North Yuba or the South Fork American River or the Middle Truckee or the Lake Tahoe West. These are all projects within TCSI that are increasing the thinning and prescribed fire work. So I think it'll be, great to see how close we can get to this target that we've set for ourselves. And in terms of prescribed fire, you asked about, increasing use of prescribed fire. So we, in these scenarios, did increase the amount of prescribed fire being used. And actually scenarios 5 and 6 were kind of the difference between more prescribed fire and less. So in scenario 3, we do have prescribed fire being used, but really 5 and 6, we're trying to tease out the difference there. Yeah. Pat, do you want to add anything in on this study or the results?
Yeah, that was great. The only thing I'll mention is that the TCSI steering committee, with the help and guidance and leadership of Aaron Ernst and the rest of the science team and other folks that are contributing to TCSI, have developed a plan, a 10-year plan based on these results and a variety of other sort of objectives, sort of compatible related objectives that kind of help flesh out, well, 60,000 acres a year, what do we want to do with those 60,000 acres, right? So there is a 10-year plan, and now there's it really kind of helped provide that foundation for that, and now those folks can work with modelers and others to really nail down where do you want those acres to go, what do you want them to do, what are some expectations, what are some costs. So it was a great kind of launching point for getting specific about this landscape and where it's going.
And I'll just add one more point and then we can take a question is, I forgot to mention that the treatments we found needed to go beyond the wildland urban interface to really affect tree mortality across this big landscape. So that was one of the other key things we found. All right, Amanda, I'm ready for questions if there's anything on this.
No questions yet. And I'll just reiterate to folks, if you do have questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A section. We'll answer them throughout the webinar. And for those that we don't have time, we can push to the end of the webinar as well.
Great. All right, Nick, let's keep going then. And we can also take the questions at the end, like Amanda said. Okay. So Nick, how do we use the data to decide where treatments will have the greatest impact?
Okay, great question. So I kind of in this answer kind of focused on two main kind of examples of how data kind of come into this this treatment impact. So we can go to the. So the first is this is an example coming from the quantitative risk quantitative wildfire risk analyst. And it's very much focused on understanding the factors that go behind risk and mapping them across space. And this is sort of specific to where across the US are communities most at risk from wildfire. And so the data that go into this are from climate models and fire spread models specifically that look at where fire probability is likely, where fire intensity is going to be high, and where communities are especially vulnerable given their exposure to wildfires. So this is one way, and this is obviously clearly important, as you see in the bottom right. Communities are absolutely at risk due to these fires. I'll just say that this is one aspect, kind of like I was mentioning in the first slide, one aspect of many in terms of developing where the goals are to develop resilient landscapes. So fire adapted communities are certainly a key and really important part of that. But when we're looking outside of the landscape, this sort of risk assessment might be less helpful in terms of where we're trying to manage for multiple resources, including improving fire dynamics. So if you go to the next slide. So this is the example that we worked off of, and this is coming from obviously the TCSI landscape where this all kind of started. And so on the left, we have this current conditions assessment that none other than Kristen Wilson helped lead up. And it was taking data that was developed for the 2.5 million acre region here. And all the different pieces of data were subjected to this sort of like fuzzy, it's called fuzzy logic. So what fuzzy logic does is it takes these raw data and it performs an evaluation so that it does a couple things. One, it helps understand where conditions are in favorable conditions or less than favorable conditions. And so that essentially would take things like trees per acre or basal area, and through the evaluation would put them on a -1 to +1 scale, and -1 being less favorable and +1 being more favorable. And the other thing that does is it puts all of the different data sources on a common footing so that you can view them all with like the same ruler, essentially. So now you don't have to worry about things like comparing tree density to fire probability, say, or high severity probability. And so Kristen and others did that across here 4 of the different pillars. And again, those pillars are coming from the framework for resilience that Pat presented on last week. And from this analysis, where conditions were generally, here we're calling them departed or less than favorable, that might suggest that management should be used to sort of improve the condition, not only for things like forest resilience, but for all of these pillars, from fire adapted communities, fire dynamics, and drought vulnerability. So I'll say that is a very common use of that technology, that fuzzy logic. So Fuzzy logic is one component of a larger decision support system, and decision support systems inherently are used to ingest a ton of data, do these types of evaluations, and provide information that managers can use to prioritize treatments across landscapes. It doesn't tell you what to do, it provides information so that you can make a decision. And so that was great. But then Kristen just presented on that application of the Landis-2 landscape simulation model, which again was run to mid-century, and it incorporated all the dynamics, key dynamics of the system, including forest growth, regeneration and establishment, and disturbances such as fires and bark beetles. And so by doing so, you can get a sense for the future potential trajectories of the landscape. And what's great is that they're spatial. So you can sort of see where on the landscape high severity fire is going to be an impediment, where trees and forests are actually doing quite well and providing multiple services. And so what we did from using those data is we added another axis to this one-dimensional axis here on the left. So we added the second dimension, which is the future conditions. So we took all of the data that was associated with the TCSI, and we did this sort of evaluation to look at what the current conditions are, and really what that's doing is asking the question, what is the state of the system? And it's specific to each of these different metrics and elements and pillars. And then we used the Landis results to do the same sort of thing, where we evaluated what is the future potential to achieve these different pillar objectives, and where are those stable over time. So if we saw that, for instance, carbon sequestration was high in some areas, but it was super variable over time, that would receive a score that would be somewhat less than 1, Or if it never achieved a high carbon potential, then it also received a score of less than 1. And so you can kind of see for every given pixel in the TCSI, you're able to sort of assess its current condition and its future condition at the same time. And you can plot them on this two-dimensional graph. And from this, we can infer 4 different management strategies. So where conditions were very good to start with in 2019, and where conditions continue to be good, that might suggest a monitoring strategy. So maybe you could have a fairly hands-off approach in terms of management, because conditions sort of stay good within the natural capacity of the system moving forward under climate change. Where conditions were good now, but we actually saw them deteriorate over time, either due to the direct influences of climate or from disturbances, that might suggest a protection strategy where we're trying to keep the things that are operating well on the landscape. Alternatively, where conditions were poor, but they got better in the future, that might suggest that management can help facilitate adapting those systems such that they are that they're sort of climate ready. So maybe that is doing thinning or fuels reduction treatments. It would depend on sort of the pillar that we're talking about. And then where conditions are poor now and poor in the future, that might suggest that some sort of transformation might occur. Alternatively, that bottom left panel might suggest that management might help, but it's going to take a lot of time and effort and money possibly to keep those conditions functioning over time under climate change, given the results of the Landis-2 modeling. So from this, just a few highlights. One, we're able to look across the hierarchy of the framework, from metrics to elements to pillars, to sort of better understand what condition they are in now, and what the potential for a good functioning future is under climate change. And we're able to map those across space so that we can see where the distribution of conditions are now and in the future, and map out the support for each of these 4 different management strategies. And so that's what we did for the TCSI. And now more recently, with the California Wildfire Task Force, we're taking these methods and applying them across all the 4 major ecoregions across California. so that we have these types of management, strategic and tactical management maps for all of our different pillars across the state.
It's pretty amazing. So that will be available in the future, the statewide integration of both current conditions, I think from probably the regional resource toolkits maybe,
Yep.
as well
Yep.
as the future conditions, which is under climate change. So you're really bringing together, you're bringing that second dimension, as you said, the y-axis here, to inform management actions. I want to ask you a couple questions because I think this is a really important advance that has been made in terms of how to bring together what we've traditionally done, which is work in the departed areas that are currently departed and try and bring them into desired or target conditions. And what you're suggesting, I think, in the figure on the right, is that we need to be really thoughtful about where we prioritize treatments that will have a lasting impact, hopefully, under climate change. So does that mean, adapt and protect are like the highest priority, or transform might be a priority, but with sort of recognition of the cost element that you were bringing up? Is that how we should interpret the figure on the right?
Yeah, I'll say that's one way that we can interpret that figure. The beauty of decision support models in general is that it's not necessarily the job of the decision support tool to suggest anything or to say that you have to do something. What it's really doing is providing a quantitative framework and information to help make a decision. So one could look at the maps that are coming out of this promote model and infer or interpret them in completely different ways, and maybe even on a case by case or geography by geography basis. So, like I said about the transforms and the monitors, one of the things I'll just say is, we know we can't manage everywhere, right? There's just not the capacity to do that, nor do we necessarily need to. And so what I like about the monitors and transforms, it just sort of takes some of the pressure off management and identifies areas that you might not want to go to first, so that now your decision space is much narrower than it was before. And so by focusing on the adapts and protects, like you mentioned, is one way of sort of better isolating the target areas and better understanding why you might want to go there and providing the quantitative evidence to support that. So that is really the job of this model. And so I can suggest ways, and we can suggest ways in how to interpret it, but ultimately we're providing many different pieces of information for managers to make the best decisions based off those outputs.
Great. And it really is, you need the decision support tool because there's so much information, all of the data from the metrics, which are underneath those 10 pillars of resilience, both current and future conditions are all being brought together in that decision support tool. So you need to have that system in place to be able to handle all of the information and to quantitatively come up with an endpoint, basically, right?
Right.
So I wonder, could you talk us through one example, maybe either modeling of high severity fire, places that are going to experience high severity fire, or maybe places that would be good for carbon sequestration, as just an example to walk us through sort of how we think about future conditions and how that might inform our actions on, in terms of forest management, just as like a case study of one example of bringing in those future conditions.
Yeah, I'll talk about the carbon one because I think that's pretty interesting, because I think, well, one, across these pillars don't necessarily operate independently. So oftentimes when we think about where the high carbon areas are, they may also be providing some unique habitat in the landscape. Maybe they're multi-layered, maybe they're older forests, maybe they have a unique species composition, maybe they haven't been touched by fire in a long time and they're in a very productive area that's prevented them from having a disturbance. So there's I think opportunities to sort of view them as these areas of stability on the landscape. So one, by taking the framework, we can basically better understand how these different values sort of work together, or sort of have synergies across the pillars. So where they're correlated, really. And so, so you can look across the landscape and see, okay, these areas are top 10%, carbon on the landscape. And so you might say like, okay, well, let's do some sort of management, maybe working around them, maybe working within them to help keep them on the landscape. Well, maybe that's a lot of area, maybe that's a lot of patches, and maybe looking into the future could help to sort of choose among those many options ones that actually have favorable conditions moving forward that might suggest that they're going to stick. They actually have the highest ability of staying on the landscape, given that they're good now and the future looks promising for that specific resource. And that's what's nice about tying each of the different future conditions to the pillars themselves. So it's not just one y-axis here. The y-axis is tailored to each of these different pillars so that we have a better understanding about not only what the climate's going to do, but how it's actually going to impact these individual resources moving forward.
Yeah, this is super exciting work and just awesome to see it. And let's take a few questions if anything came in, Amanda, on the chat.
No questions have come in on the chat yet, but I actually had a question, if you guys don't mind me asking.
Go for it.
So you both mentioned the pillars, and I think a lot of folks who are attending probably attended last week's webinar on the framework for resilience, but there might be a couple folks who didn't and who maybe haven't heard of the pillars before. Would you mind just giving just like a quick, really short, like 1 or 2 sentences of just what the pillars are and maybe what 4 pillars you were mentioning about the ones that were used for current condition assessment? Just curious what they are.
I feel like this is a quiz to see if I can remember all 10 of the pillars. And so I'm gonna give it a go, and then Nick and Pat, please fill in. So we have a very beautiful diagram that's a circle of all the 10 pillars of resilience that span both social and ecological pillars. So let's start with, we have fire dynamics, fire adapted communities, forest resilience, water security, carbon sequestration, wetland integrity, socio and economic well-being, I think is the right phrasing for that one. Oh, help. We have 3 more.
Biodiversity,
Oh my
conservation.
gosh.
You're
Wow.
amazing though, Kristen. That was amazing.
That's embarrassing as the Nature Conservancy. So biodiversity conservation, thank you very much, Nick. Okay, we're gonna get through this. 2 more.
Air quality.
Thank you. Yes, air quality. Last one, Pat.
Economic diversity.
What's that?
Economic diversity.
Thank you very much. Economic diversity. So together we can get through the 10. Those are the 10 pillars of resilience that were described by Pat in the last webinar, which will be posted soon on the TCSI website. Underneath their elements and metrics, Pat, do you want to talk a little bit more about? No, okay.
Well, yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, you're doing a great job.
Underneath the pillars, there are elements and then metrics to measure, and these are actually things that, in the case that Nick's talking about, we've mapped. And so those maps of the different pillars for current conditions were created basically for the entire state under the regional resource toolkits that are available on the wildfire and crisis. Oh my gosh, sorry. The state's website on the wildfire crisis. Help me, someone. What is it called again?
Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force.
Thank you, Pat. Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. So if you want to go and see an amazing resource of data for current conditions and visualization of it, that's on Planscape. So this grew, out of work in Tahoe-Central Sierra Initiative, but it's grown to the state now. And in terms of the future conditions, Nick was saying this is going to be now the future conditions for the state are going to be integrated in so that you'll be able to use this for management strategy system to prioritize where to do work. It's not done yet, but it's almost done, right? Okay.
We're polishing.
Polishing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that will
Awesome.
be available. That will be available on Planscape.
Yeah, I think you just go to planscape.org. Yeah.
So this is kind of the growth that happened from Tahoe-Central Sierra initiative out.
Great. Thanks so much, Kristen. And huge kudos for being able to list that many on the spot like that. I think, yeah, it just helps, just in case folks weren't sure what we're talking about when we say pillars. And another question did come in. So if we have time for one more before the next section. Are the decision support tools easily accessible for other organizations? Is this being incorporated into Planscape or stay within Land Astute? So I think you just answered that. But if there's anything you want to elaborate on.
Yeah, I'll reiterate that it's eventually going to make its way into the Planscape tool, and from those, you can use you'll be able to use the outputs from the promote model and integrate it into other tools like Forces, which is a way to sort of optimize treatments when you have a multiple objective scenario where you're trying to manage for more than just one thing. So the Planscape really offers a whole suite of different modules, from a data module where it's taking data directly from these regional resource kits across the state. You have the opportunity to use the promote model right in there to do these types of analyses we've been talking about. And then you can develop multiple different planning scenarios based on different goals and objectives, and sort of see where different treatment patches sort of result, and where there's consistency across objectives or where there's differences. And so the idea, again, is to give managers access to these more complicated, complex sort of models, but provide a very simple interface so that anybody can sort of pick it up and use it.
Right, let's go on to our last section here, and let's see here. All right, I think we're both kind of answering this one, Nick, but you described how we determine where to prioritize treatments based on those 4 different strategies. And let's see, I can talk a little bit about how the North Yuba started to use this approach that you just described.
I think that'd be great.
Okay, excellent. All right, so the North Yuba Landscape Resilience Project. North Yuba is also a collaborative forest landscape restoration program landscape, as well as a wildfire crisis strategy landscape. So one of the priority landscapes. It's in the Tahoe-Central Sierra Initiative area. It's about 275,000 acres. So it's one of those big project areas that I was talking about before. And while the project was being planned, we were both developing the pillars of resilience and the framework and the blueprint here, as well as Vibrant Planet was in charge of helping to lead the planning up. So we have integration of Vibrant Planet's methodology, which is a group that works to help people plan out forest management strategies using science as well. And they were relying on a lot of work that Kevin McGarrigle and others had done on historic range of variability. So what kind of gaps did we have in the forest historically and that we don't have today? And what type of serial stages do we need to shift the landscape towards to be more resilient to fire? So there was this whole effort that was focused a lot on the historic range of variability and bringing that into the planning. At the same time, we're trying to grapple with climate change and make that transition that Nick was talking about, where, we're looking back, but we're also looking very much forward and incorporating the climate change projections. So during the middle of this, the North Yuba project, which is a collaboration of many different entities, so different partners, came together to figure out which pillars of resilience did they care the most about? What was the central focus of this project? And the pie chart on the right shows you the results from that synthesis of like, what did this group care the most about? What were they trying to prioritize? And so fire dynamics and fire adapted communities and forest resilience were really at the top. And then also biodiversity conservation and water reliability. So those were the pillars that became the main focus of the planning effort to prioritize where to do thinning and prescribed burning first across this big landscape. And it was really helpful to have the pillars of resilience and the terminology to talk to each other about what we meant by resilience, to define it here in terms of these pillars, and then to use that to focus the planning. We also did bring in a climate change alternative. So if you know, in the NEPA process, you have alternatives that are considered. And one of them that we brought in sort of towards the end of the planning was this climate change alternative. And that was an integration of the adapt and protect areas that Nick was talking about. So areas in the North Yuba where based on these pillars, we thought that there was, a likelihood that management would have a beneficial impact that would last in the future. At the same time, the Vibrant Planet was producing a visualization of how biophysical units across the landscape were going to change. So areas that maybe have higher site productivity today might dry out in the future. So they were bringing additional climate change information in, and we brought those two pieces together to try and develop a climate change alternative, which was considered. It wasn't analyzed in detail in the plan because it didn't differ that much from the alternative that was proposed, but it was considered, and it is described in the project documentation. So to me, it was a big step forward in terms of bringing this climate change thinking of how do we use information about future temperature and precipitation and how things are changing to inform our management actions today. And I'm looking forward to, seeing more advances in how projects are able to incorporate all of this amazing information that has been pulled together for the future conditions, and thinking about management strategies beyond that just current conditions focus, to thinking about how do we bring in the future conditions and think about what to do where. So this is just one example. I think there's going to be a lot more in the future, but I wanted to talk about this specific one, which we were involved with.
Great, thank you, Kristen.
Yeah. Let's see here. So any questions on this last section?
No questions have come up.
All right, great. Well, that's all we have to present. If there's any other questions on the whole presentation that we've done, we have some time now to take them. We have about 10 minutes.
If anyone has questions, feel free to direct them to the Q&A. I think you guys explained everything so well that people really get it.
Oh, good. Pat has one.
Yeah, well, I think what would a topic, and I'm happy to pitch into this as well, but I think we touched a fair bit on kind of individual metrics and their condition and their opportunity to improve those conditions given current and future climate. It might be helpful to talk a little bit about kind of alignment of conditions, like within a pillar and among the pillars. So how different the different metric representations might be within a given pillar, and what does that mean? Or what are the implications for that? Meaning all of the metrics are in favorable or unfavorable condition, or maybe they're mixed. And then among the pillars. And I think that, some of the, it might help understand a little bit more, or kind of challenge our thinking, I guess, about how do we deal with a multi-metric world, really a complex world that not only has multiple things that we're concerned about. Like, I think the North Yuba example was a great one, where we have multiple pillars that are of interest. What if they're maybe if you chose one of those three, it would take you to one set of conditions. If you chose another one of those three, it would take you to a different set of locations, I should say, on the landscape. So I thought I'd maybe start with Nick in terms of talking a little bit about like managing landscapes. What does it mean to manage landscapes, as opposed to how we might sort of gravitate in our thinking toward the condition of a location, and where are those conditions favorable, where are they unfavorable, and what one might do about that in a given location. What are some additional considerations in terms of managing landscapes and changing the, toward having a more sort of positive disturbance regime across the entire landscape, which is where we hope and expect sort of reduced risk and increased resilience will really come from at that landscape scale.
Softball question. Great. Yeah. That's a pretty in-depth question, but so the way that I conceptualize this in my head is that, there's inherently trade-offs and synergies among these different pillars, like we were saying. So, where carbon stocks are high, like I was saying, there's probably there could be, or likely there's older forests, larger trees, multiple canopy layers. So on where you're looking for, where the carbon pillar, the biodiversity pillar, possibly the forest resilience pillar, maybe could be in alignment with in those locations. But obviously there's trade-offs when you have that complex structure with fire. So you're going to necessarily see, if you're managing for, forest resilience, carbon and biodiversity, as well as fire, you're going to see some uncertainty or sort of middle of the road scores for each of the different management strategies. So, a few things that we've been doing is one, sort of viewing each of the pillars in isolation to better understand where in the landscape are we seeing these ecosystem services and functions actually in good condition and where they're going to stick. So it's taking that sort of multivariate lens and sort of teasing it apart a little so that we better understand the sort of overall, what is this landscape providing, what is it good at, and where are there areas that are either the climate's going to be a challenge or the current conditions are out of whack, so that maybe we can sort of focus management on one or multiple of those pillars to sort of move everything in sort of a better condition. Alternatively, there's trade-offs associated with that too, where maybe you need to choose one or the other to manage for. So maybe in those instances where fires and climate is going to be a challenge to carbon and biodiversity, maybe you look for alternative areas that don't have those limitations. And so, but I think the main message is you really need, and this is what I think that the framework and the promote model does well, is you really need to take a whole accounting of these functions and values on the landscape so you better understand what you're working with now and how vulnerable these conditions are moving forward. So all of those different factors, as well as things like these HVRAs, or these high valued resources and assets, where are these on maybe you have a community that's right smack dab in the middle of your landscape. Maybe the other priorities are less important, and all you're really wanting to do there is sort of reduce high severity fire, reduce fire probability, and help protect these communities. So I think by taking a view at the landscape, you're able to then zoom in on different areas and better understand what the trade-offs are by managing for individual resources and where you have the opportunity to sort of leave the landscape be and let it kind of do its thing. I don't know if that was helpful, but
Yeah, thanks so
that's
much.
great.
That was helpful. We do have a question and a comment that just came in. I'll go ahead and read the comment really quick so we can get to the question. And the question seems like a great extension to the question that you just asked, Pat. But the comment was, this was very simple and informative to understand this climate change model in regards to forest management. This is incredible work, and I enjoyed learning about the pillars of resilience. So thank you, Alondra. And then a question from Anna, which is kind of a great extension to what we were just talking about. How do you weigh other prioritization criteria like feasibility or likeliness of completion? I'm thinking about areas that might be highly prioritized for the reasons discussed, but might be difficult to implement because it's on a region with multiple landowners, or be difficult to fund for whatever reason.
I'll let other Kristen.
We'll take a shot at that.
Great.
Oh, go ahead, Kristen.
No, I wanted you to take it. Perfect.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just start. I think you know, it is a good follow on to that earlier topic of you know, kind of taking the whole landscape into consideration. Where, as Nick said, where are the locations that are just sort of uniquely able to accomplish certain or provide certain services or benefits? And, you know, hopefully they're in locations where you can prioritize those. And as I think the question or comment identified, you know, there are going to be some locations in the landscape where it's going to be very expensive and potentially controversial to maintain or improve certain conditions. How important are they in that location? And the only way you can get to that answer is to look at the whole landscape. How important is that place in that entire landscape? So it provides this context for both investment, expectation, and really the work that it's already that certain locations in the landscape are already doing, and how important is that work? Like Nick was saying, you know, are there anchors of old forest and there are only a few? Then those might be far more important than if, you know, a large proportion of the landscape is old forest, and although we value that, maybe not every acre is going to be critical to maintain, and therefore a balance of objectives and benefits could be better achieved across that landscape. So I think this landscape context provides a lot of information, and it's sort of a critical aspect of what resilience means, because no one acre can be resilient. It's really about the entire landscape, how it's interacting over time, how these pillars are so essentially supporting each other. That's what the pillars do, is they really support each other. So good, you know, a functional fire regime will support resilient forests, will maintain biodiversity, and the converse is also true. Any one of them in really poor condition makes it tough to accomplish anything across that landscape. So, and as we know with fire, it touches at every aspect of these landscapes, every pillar, every life. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Kristen and Nick, is there anything you wanted to add to that before we wrap up?
Just briefly, I think, you know, feasibility and operability is really important, because some areas are going to cost a lot more to treat. But I think when you sort of bring that in after you sort of identify the places where, you know, you want to focus your work, then it forces that conversation about, can we treat this area? You know, is it feasible? And so I think, I know there was some discussion early on with Planscape about being able to put in operable areas based on current operability and budgets and so forth. So this question is right in line with sort of the second step, which is, okay, once you prioritize those locations, what can you do, where, and how much is it going to cost?
That was great, Kristen. I was going to say pretty much the same thing. So thanks.
Great, thanks for that. Well, there's no other questions coming in, and I think we're just right at about time. So I just want to take a minute to thank all of our speakers, Dr. Kristen Wilson, Dr. Nick Povak, and Dr. Patricia Manley for sharing their work with us today, and also to the California Tahoe Conservancy for making this event possible. Within a few weeks, you'll be able to find a copy of this recording and a copy of the last webinar's recording on our brand new website, www.tahoe-centralsierra.org. And we highly encourage you to reach out to our speakers directly for more information, or to connect with TCSI partners directly about forest health issues and other topics from this webinar series. I believe that their contact information was posted in the chat, so hopefully you can find it there along with the website. And I also wanted to remind folks that, again, this is the second webinar of a three-part series. We do have one more. So our upcoming webinar on November 15th will highlight new research from the University of Washington School of Public Health about the smoke impacts of wildfire and prescribed fire, and it'll offer recommendations for land managers seeking to reduce smoke impacts on public health and public safety. So please feel free to share that webinar registration broadly with your partners, and please feel free to share these webinar recordings with your partners as well. Thank you everyone for attending, and thanks again to our panelists. That was super informative. I was actually taking notes. I was learning a lot. And yeah, thank you for working to improve forest health in the Tahoe-Central Sierra landscape and in the state and beyond. So have a great rest of your day all, and Happy Wednesday.